In other words, your argument, your atheism, is not simply undermining Christianity. Well, of course it tries to do that. It's undermining science.
Oh, so all atheists are irrational, Professor. Is that what you're saying?
I often discuss this with colleagues.
Yeah, so the majority of your colleagues are what? Not very smart? Because otherwise they believe in inherited sin, vicarious redemption, virgin births, and resurrections just like you.
Okay.
In this riveting episode of Gotcha Atheists, John Lennox presents his piece de resistance, a definitive proof that atheists undermine science, and thus the only rational option is to affirm theism, and preferably Christianity. Here's how John set the stage.
How is it that a scientist with her mind looking at the universe can understand something and reduce it to mathematics? Now, I often discuss this with colleagues, and I say, look, you do science with what you call your brain if you don't believe in the mind. Tell me about the brain. And often they will say, well, the brain in the end is a product of a mindless, unguided process.
Okay, so far, John has claimed that his atheist colleagues don't believe in the mind.
If you don't believe in the mind, tell me about the brain.
But I'm going to let that one slide, as 1, it's not relevant to John's argument, and 2, getting into the philosophy of mind will take way too long.
We're not even going to go there.
John's more relevant claim is that his atheist colleagues insist that the brain is the result of unguided processes, which is an ambiguous term that's going to need unpacking a little later on. He continues.
And I often have said to people, and it's been very interesting to do this, if you knew that your computer that you use every day was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? And I've always forced an answer, gently of course, but nevertheless I've forced an answer. And it's always been no.
Always been no. Really? So every one of John's atheist colleagues has said that they wouldn't trust a computer if it was produced by unguided processes without asking any clarifying questions.
And it's always been no.
There's so much to unpack, but patience is a virtue. Let's let him land.
Now I say you have a problem because you're inconsistent. You're telling me that what you're doing science with, that you can't trust. Really.
Needless to say, John claiming that all his atheist colleagues have the major issue of, their entire epistemology being inconsistent is a very significant claim. And as we can see, he believes he substantiated this with his forced question pertaining to a computer. A big claim, indeed, that I'm looking forward to tackling.
But wait! There's more!
Now, I have a reason for trusting my mind, at least in part, because it is ultimately the product of the vast intelligence of a personal God, as is the universe out there. And that's why the two match together. But you don't have that.
Here, we get the assertion that theists like John can be certain of their brain's ability to comprehend truth.
At least in part.
Because the brain is the product of intelligent design, a crucial factor that his atheist colleagues apparently lack.
In other words, your argument, your atheism, is not simply undermining Christianity. Well, of course it tries to do that. It's undermining science.
Finally, John reiterates his central point, emphasizing that atheism and rationality are, at the foundational level, incompatible. Theism is rational.
I have a reason for trusting my mind.
Whereas atheism is not rational.
It's undermining science.
All right, now that we've identified these claims, let's respond to each in turn, starting with the brain being unguided.
And often they will say, well, the brain in the end is a product of a mindless, unguided process.
So, how did our brains emerge? Evolution by natural selection. That is, a process that is unguided in the sense that it lacks a predetermined goal or conscious overseer, but is very much guided by the principles of inheritance, variation, reproduction, and survival. So, not random. And here lays the issue. How is John defining unguided? Is his use of the word mindless a synonym to accompany unguided, or is this an addition?
Mindless, unguided process.
Because while evolution is unguided in the sense that there is no conscious mind driving it, It's undoubtedly not a cosmic game of pin the tail on the donkey. Natural selection is a relentless, exacting process. It's a far cry from the random and whimsical picture that John is depicting. We have to ask, even if it's just to exercise a tiny amount of skepticism, did John specify to all his colleagues how he's defining unguided? We have a serious problem here with a lack of clarity that John, at least, suggests his colleagues didn't question. In any case, after John has got his colleagues to admit that the brain is the product of unguided forces, he forces them to answer the gotcha question.
If you knew that your computer that you use every day was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? And I've always forced an answer, gently of course, but nevertheless I've forced an answer, and it's always been no.
Well, given the diversity of thought among scientists and philosophers, John's insistence that all of his colleagues, without exception, answered no to his quite obviously loaded question is very, very unlikely. I mean, seriously, please, let's use our brains here. Given the context of John speaking about the brain as a product of unguided processes, don't you think that if his colleagues hadn't already asked him to define unguided before, at least some of them surely did after he dropped his chaotic computer question?
And it's always been no.
Are we seriously to believe that not one of his fellow professors, most of whom are atheists, said, "John, what are you playing at here, mate? Would you mind defining what you mean by unguided? Do you mean completely random?" But okay, let's assume that all of John's colleagues are, for some reason, completely incapable of spotting obvious equivocations.
I see nothing.
The issue is that, as mentioned earlier, brains are not the result of utter random chaos. They are refined, shaped by the mindless, unguided forces of natural selection. This is why convergent evolution is a thing. The reason the same designs, if you will, have evolved multiple times is because they've been guided by the principles of inheritance, variation, reproduction, and survival. Computers, however, are a product of intentional human design and innovation. That is, they are guided by conscious beings, us. So, of course, if a computer weren't guided by an intelligent agency, it wouldn't function. The same isn't true, though, of the brain. It's a false analogy, which is something that intelligent design proponents, like John, often rely upon. Lastly, John's boast of forcing an answer raises ethical questions about the nature of his conversations.
And I've always forced an answer.
Forcing answers, especially when keywords are, perhaps deliberately, unclear, isn't a sign of genuine intellectual exchange. It's a sign of trying to win a debate against someone who isn't even aware that they're engaging in one.
Now I say you have a problem because you're inconsistent. You're telling me that what you're doing science with, that you can't trust, really.
This can only be a fair assessment if all of John's colleagues, upon witnessing his analogy with computers, agreed that the brain is utterly random and in no way refined to, at least to some degree, accurately track reality. And I highly doubt that. Surely, we must ask, John knows that any atheist listening to him can see through this, no? This whole shtick is, of course, a rendition of C.S. Lewis's argument from Reason, an argument I've dedicated a whole video to, which I've linked below. Now, John goes on to say that he's actually presenting Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism.
But the conflict, the deep conflict, as Alvin Plantinga's put it.
But it's not, at least not in the way that John has presented it. In a nutshell, Plantinga's argument relies on probability theory, specifying alleged incompatibility between affirming both naturalism and evolution, while Lewis's argument relies on intuitive appeals and analogies with no probabilistic analysis. Compounding things, unlike the aforementioned names, John hasn't been upfront with his argument, instead concealing his premise behind vague language that's highly susceptible to equivocation, all while forcing his colleagues to answer him.
And I've always forced an answer.
Again, I recommend my dedicated video on this argument for those wanting a more thorough analysis. But, in a nutshell, John's argument rests on a gross mischaracterization of evolution. The human brain is not the product of random chaos, but instead finely crafted by natural selection. Our cognitive abilities have been shaped by evolutionary pressures to accurately track, albeit imperfectly, the world we inhabit. This has obviously been a major advantage to our survival. I mean, look at it this way. If two groups of humans evolved on either side of a dirty, cholera-infested river, and one group evolved to distrust all flowing water and only drink rainwater, while the other evolved to simply be cautious around new water sources, while both would survive, the latter group would have a significant advantage, especially as the climate changes. The ability to accurately assess and react to the environment, like determining whether water is contaminated, directly impacts survival and reproduction. Evolution, then, favours cognitive faculties that can recognize patterns and track truth, because truth, or at least accuracy, is advantageous. Reliable cognitive mechanisms enable better decision making, which ultimately aids in survival, ensuring that accurate perceptions of reality are selected for over time. The fact that our brains evolve through natural processes doesn't warrant the conclusion that we can't trust our cognitive faculties at all. At most, it conveys that we can't be absolutely certain about any of our beliefs, a point that epistemologists have long grappled with, regardless of one's stance on theism or atheism.
Now, I have a reason for trusting my mind, at least in part, because it is ultimately the product of the vast intelligence of a personal God, as is the universe out there. And that's why the two match together. But you don't have that.
Like so much of Christian presuppositionalism, this argument follows the same scheme. Point out a problematic epistemological concern, boast that your opposition can't solve it, and then simply presuppose that you can.
I have a reason for trusting my mind.
Do you? Are you sure? I mean, come on, John. You're a smart guy. You've surely heard of the whole evil demon problem that Descartes grappled with. What's your solution, my dude? The sheer irony, I trust, is palpable. John's sitting there, using his God-given mind to conclude that his mind is reliable because it was created by God. But wait a minute, how did he reach the conclusion about God's existence in the first place? Oh, right, with his mind. Who now is the dog chasing his own tail? Put another way, John's got the gall to mock atheists for using their brains to reason that their brains are reliable. Meanwhile, he's doing the exact same thing with just an extra step. He's using his brain to reason that God exists, then using that God belief to justify trusting his brain. It's precisely the same circularity he mocks, but with an extra node. Compounding this, John specified that he can only trust part of his brain.
At least in part.
Well, which part, John? The part that believes in virgin births and resurrections, or the part that does mathematics? Because I've got to tell you, one of those seems to be a bit more reliable than the other. The truth is, we're all in the same boat here. Theist or atheist, we're all using imperfect, evolved brains to try to make sense of the world. The difference is, some of us are honest about the limitations and uncertainties that come with this, while others...
I have a reason for trusting my mind.
Well, they're claiming that they've got a cosmic guarantee of reliability. To give just one more cherry on top, consider this question. If God designed our minds to perfectly track truth, why do we make so many mistakes? Why do we have cognitive biases? Why do people believe in a flat earth, or that Frank Turek understands anything, or that Hinduism is true? Especially if eternal consequences are threatened if we don't somehow use our brains to come to affirm incredibly improbable propositions. So, once again, while presenting himself in a kind and humble manner, John is anything but. He's just another example of presuppositional apologetics, doing what it does best, assuming the conclusion and mocking others for not doing the same.
You have a problem.
It's a rhetorical sleight of hand that might sound convincing if, ironically, you don't use your brain, but it falls apart under the most basic scrutiny. Anyhow, as always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to everyone who supports the channel. I'm trying my best to expand my team and multiply my production, and if you'd like to help me in doing this, then please consider chucking us a few coins to help with office rent, monitors, and the fuel that powers us. Coffee.